You have to understand something fundamental about human behavior. Patterns are where people feel safe. And in relationships with avoidance, there is almost always a pattern, one that repeats so consistently, it becomes invisible. They pull away, you lean in, they go silent, you try to fix it, they create distance, and you close the gap. Over time, this dynamic doesn't just happen. It becomes expected. And once it's expected, it becomes a form of control. Not necessarily conscious control, not some calculated strategy, but a psychological equilibrium. They regulate the intensity by withdrawing, and you regulate the connection by pursuing. It's a loop, a predictable, self-reinforcing loop. And here's the truth most people miss. As long as you stay inside that loop, nothing will ever change, because the loop is the relationship. Now, the moment you step outside of that pattern, everything shifts. And I mean everything. Not gradually, not subtly, it disrupts the entire system. When you stop chasing, when you stop reacting emotionally to their distance, when you stop trying to decode every silence or repair every fracture, you're not just acting differently. You're breaking the structure that held the dynamic together. And for the avoidant, that's disorienting. Why? Because what used to work no longer works. Their withdrawal used to create a response in you. It used to pull you closer, make you more available, more expressive, sometimes even more vulnerable. That response reassured them in a paradoxical way. It told them the connection was still there, even if they weren't fully engaging in it. But when your response disappears, when the emotional feedback loop goes quiet, they're left facing something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidants are not comfortable with. So what happens next is critical. At first, they may not even notice consciously. They might assume you're just busy or that you'll come back into your usual role. But as the pattern continues to break, as you remain grounded, composed, and emotionally self-contained, they begin to feel it. Not as clarity, but as disruption. Because now there's no script, there's no predictable reaction to lean on, no emotional safety net of knowing exactly how you'll respond. And that's when the internal shift begins. They start to question, even if they don't articulate it, why aren't they reacting? Why aren't they chasing? What changed? And here's the key distinction. You didn't change to manipulate them. You changed because you stopped abandoning yourself. That's the difference between a tactic and a transformation. When you genuinely detach from the need to control the outcome, when your focus shifts from managing their behavior to honoring your own emotional stability, you become unpredictable in the healthiest possible way. Not chaotic, grounded, not distant, self-possessed. And that breaks the pattern more powerfully than any confrontation ever could. Because confrontation still keeps you inside the loop. It's still a reaction. It still signals that your emotional state is tied to their behavior. But when you step out of that entirely, when your presence is no longer governed by their inconsistency, the entire dynamic loses its foundation. This is the moment their control fails. Not because you took power from them, but because you stopped giving it away. And in that moment, whether they admit it or not, they feel the shift. The old version of you, the one that kept the pattern alive, is no longer available. And without that version, the dynamic they relied on cannot exist in the same way. That's when everything begins to change, because when the pattern breaks, the illusion of control breaks with it. And once that pattern is broken, something even more powerful begins to emerge. Your emotional independence. Not as an idea, not as something you say, but as something you embody. And this is where the real shift happens, because independence at this level is not loud, it's not performative, and it's not reactive. It's quiet, grounded, and deeply felt. Most people misunderstand what emotional independence actually is. They think it means detaching completely, not caring or shutting down, but that's not independence. That's avoidance in a different form. Real emotional independence means you can care, you can feel, you can be open without needing someone else to regulate your sense of worth. It means your stability is not contingent on their presence, their attention, or their approval. And for an avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory, because the dynamic they're used to often involves a subtle imbalance. Even if they don't consciously seek it, they are accustomed to being the one who dictates the pace of closeness. They pull back and the other person leans in. They go quiet and the other person fills the silence. That imbalance creates a kind of psychological comfort. It allows them to engage without fully surrendering control. But when you become emotionally independent, that imbalance disappears. You're no longer seeking validation from their responses. You're no longer analyzing every word, every delay, every shift in tone. You're not trying to win them back or prove your worth. Instead, you're anchored in something far more stable, your own sense of self. And here's what's fascinating. This doesn't push them away in the way people fear it will. In fact, it often does the opposite. But not for the reasons people assume. It's not that they suddenly recognize your value in a dramatic, conscious way. It's that your behavior no longer fits the pattern they understand. You're no longer predictable in the old sense. You're not reacting, not chasing, not trying to close the gap they create. And that creates a kind of psychological tension because now they have to meet you differently, or not at all. Your independence removes the emotional leverage that used to exist. There's nothing for them to pull against. No overextension, no urgency, no pressure coming from you. And in that absence, something subtle but significant happens. They begin to feel the weight of their own distance. Before, your effort compensated for their withdrawal. Now it doesn't. And that forces a level of awareness they often avoid. They can no longer rely on your energy to maintain the connection. If the connection is going to exist, they have to contribute to it. And for someone who is used to operating from a place of emotional self-protection, that's a challenge. But your independence doesn't demand anything. That's what makes it powerful. You're not asking them to show up differently. You're not trying to convince them, persuade them, or even confront them. You've simply shifted your center of gravity back to yourself. And in doing so, you've changed the terms of the interaction entirely. Now, whether they step forward or stay distant is no longer something you're trying to control. It becomes a reflection of where they are, not a measure of your worth. And that's the deeper psychological shift. When you stop needing them to validate your value, you stop participating in any dynamic that requires you to prove it. For the avoidant, this creates a quiet but undeniable signal. You are no longer emotionally available for the old pattern. Not because you've closed yourself off, but because you've outgrown the need for inconsistency. And that realization can be disarming, because it introduces something they can't easily navigate. Someone who is present, open, but not dependent. Someone who chooses connection rather than needing it. And when they feel that, when they recognize, even subconsciously, that your presence is a choice, not a requirement, it changes how they see you. Not as someone to manage, but as someone they could lose. And that's where the dynamic begins to turn. Because emotional independence doesn't create distance. It creates clarity. And as that clarity settles in, the way you communicate begins to change as well. Not because you're trying to send a message, but because you no longer feel the same urgency to explain yourself, defend your position, or extract certainty from someone who isn't offering it. This is where silence starts to carry a different kind of weight. Most people, when faced with distance, instinctively move toward confrontation. They want answers. They want definitions. They want resolution. And that's understandable, because ambiguity creates discomfort. But here's what often goes unnoticed. In dynamics with avoidance, emotional intensity, especially in the form of confrontation, doesn't create clarity. It creates pressure. And pressure triggers retreat. So the more you push for answers in that state, the more they withdraw. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because the emotional demand exceeds what they feel capable of handling. And the cycle repeats. But when you reach a point of emotional independence, something shifts in how you respond. You're no longer driven by that same need to resolve everything immediately. You're no longer trying to force alignment through intensity. Instead, you begin to allow space, not as a strategy, but as a natural extension of your stability. And that's where silence becomes powerful. Not silence as punishment, not silence as manipulation, but silence as composure, as restraint, as the ability to sit with uncertainty without trying to control it. For an avoidant, this is deeply unfamiliar. They are used to emotional reactions, questions, explanations, even frustration. Those reactions, in a paradoxical way, give them something to orient around. They know how to respond to intensity. They step back. They create distance. It's a learned response. But when that intensity is absent, when you don't chase, don't argue, don't demand immediate clarity, they lose that reference point. There's no pressure to escape, but there's also no reassurance to rely on, just space. And in that space, something interesting happens. They're left alone with their own thoughts. Now, for someone who tends to avoid emotional processing, this can be uncomfortable because without external noise, without your reactions filling the gap, they begin to feel what they've been bypassing. The absence of your voice doesn't bring them relief. It brings them face to face with their own internal dialogue. And that's where awareness begins. They start to notice the shift, even if they can't fully articulate it. The lack of reaction, the absence of pursuit, it doesn't feel like rejection, but it doesn't feel familiar either. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. Why isn't this affecting them the way it used to? Why aren't they responding? And the more consistent your calm becomes, the more that question lingers. Because silence, when it comes from a place of grounded presence, is not empty. It communicates boundaries without words. It reflects self-respect without confrontation. It signals that you are no longer participating in a dynamic that requires you to overextend just to maintain connection. And importantly, it removes their ability to deflect. When there's no argument, there's nothing to counter. When there's no emotional escalation, there's nothing to escape. And without those familiar exit points, they are left in a position they're not used to being in, one where they have to engage with their own experience rather than react to yours. This doesn't guarantee that they will suddenly open up or transform. That's not the point. The point is that the dynamic itself is no longer driven by imbalance. You're no longer trying to pull clarity out of confusion. You're allowing behavior to speak for itself, and that, in many ways, is the clearest communication there is. Because when you stop explaining your worth, stop negotiating your needs, and stop reacting to inconsistency, you create a space where the truth of the connection becomes visible, without distortion. And in that space, whether they step forward or remain distant, you're no longer guessing. You're seeing. And that changes everything. Because silence, when rooted in self-respect, doesn't push people away. It reveals where they truly stand. And as you begin to see more clearly, without chasing, without over-explaining, another layer of this dynamic reveals itself. What unsettles an avoidant at this stage isn't just your absence. It's not simply that you've stepped back or gone quiet. It's that something far more significant has shifted beneath the surface. They can no longer influence you in the way they once did. And that's a different kind of loss. Because earlier, even in their distance, there was still a thread of control, not necessarily intentional, not always conscious, but present. Their withdrawal would trigger a response. Their silence would create movement. Their inconsistency would pull you into engagement. In subtle ways, the connection still revolved around their pace, their comfort, their timing, but now that influence is gone. You're no longer reacting to their distance as if it's a signal you need to interpret. You're no longer adjusting your emotional state based on their availability. And most importantly, you're no longer organizing your behavior around keeping the connection intact at any cost. That changes the entire psychological equation. Because control in a relationship isn't always about dominance, it's about predictability. It's about knowing, even implicitly, how the other person will respond. And when that predictability disappears, it creates instability. For the avoidant, this instability can feel disorienting. Not because they've lost something they fully understood, but because they've lost something they relied on without realizing it. The ability to create distance and still feel connected through your pursuit, that's no longer there. And without it, they begin to feel a kind of tension that wasn't present before. It's not just the absence of you, it's the absence of access. They can't reach you in the same way. They can't trigger the same emotional responses. They can't rely on the same dynamic to reassure themselves that the connection still exists on their terms. And that's where a deeper psychological response starts to emerge. Because now they're not just observing your behavior, they're experiencing the consequences of their own. Before, your efforts softened the impact of their distance. It filled in the gaps. It maintained continuity. But now, there's nothing compensating for that withdrawal. When they step back, they feel the full weight of that step, and that can be unsettling. It forces a kind of awareness that's difficult to avoid, the realization that the connection is no longer something they can passively participate in, that if it's going to exist, it requires presence, consistency, and a level of engagement they may not be used to offering. But here's where it becomes important to stay grounded in truth. This isn't about making them feel loss as a form of punishment. It's not about trying to provoke a reaction or create a sense of urgency in them. It's about no longer protecting them from the natural consequences of their behavior. There's a difference. When you stop overcompensating, when you stop absorbing the emotional imbalance, you allow the dynamic to reflect reality more accurately. And in that reflection, they begin to see something they may have been avoiding, not just who you are without the pattern, but who they are within it. And that awareness can create a shift, not always immediate, not always expressed, but internal. They begin to recognize that your presence is no longer guaranteed, that your engagement is no longer automatic, that the connection they may have taken for granted now requires intention. And that's where the dynamic begins to turn. Not because you've forced it, but because you've stopped distorting it. You've removed the illusion of control by removing your participation in it. And in doing so, you've created something far more powerful than reaction. You've created consequence. Because when someone can no longer influence your emotional state, they're finally confronted with their own. And once they're confronted with that internal shift, when the old levers no longer move you, when the distance they create no longer guarantees your return, something subtle begins to take shape. It doesn't arrive as clarity or confession. It begins as curiosity, because human behavior is deeply driven by patterns, but it's equally driven by disruption. When something that used to be predictable suddenly isn't, the mind tries to resolve that gap. It wants to understand what changed, why it changed, and what it means. And in this case, what changed is you. You're no longer reacting the way you used to. You're no longer filling the silence, no longer chasing connection, no longer trying to decode their inconsistency. And that absence of reaction doesn't read as indifference. It reads as something they can't quite categorize. And that's where curiosity starts to grow. Why aren't they reaching out? Why don't they seem affected? Did they move on? Did something shift? These questions don't always surface consciously, but they begin to influence behavior. Because now, instead of you orienting yourself around them, they begin, subtly, often reluctantly, to orient themselves around you. And here's the important distinction. This isn't about them suddenly becoming emotionally available or deeply self-aware. It's about the psychological need to resolve uncertainty. When someone can no longer predict your behavior, they become more attentive to it. They start watching more closely, not always in obvious ways, but in small, telling shifts. They may check in unexpectedly. They may reinitiate contact under neutral pretenses. They may bring up conversations that feel slightly more open than before. It's not a full transformation, it's a shift in direction. Curiosity moves them closer, but it's critical to understand what's driving that movement. It's not always love in the way people hope it is. Sometimes it's the loss of familiarity. Sometimes it's the disruption of control. Sometimes it's simply the need to understand why the dynamic no longer behaves the way it used to. And if you're not grounded, this is where it's easy to misinterpret the signal, because attention can feel like intention. Effort can feel like change, but they're not the same thing. So as they begin to move closer, through questions, through presence, through subtle attempts to reconnect, your role doesn't shift back to who you were. You don't step back into the pattern just because the pattern is trying to reform around you. You stay where you are, grounded, observant, unmoved by inconsistency, because what you're watching now is not just their behavior, it's their capacity, their willingness to meet you in a new way, not just momentarily, but consistently. And that requires time, not reaction. Curiosity may open the door, but it doesn't build the foundation. And this is where your earlier shift becomes essential. Because if your independence was real, if your silence came from clarity, not strategy, then you won't be pulled back in by temporary changes. You'll see them for what they are, signals, not solutions. And from that place, you respond differently. You don't reject them. You don't chase them. You meet them where they are, but you don't lower yourself to where you used to be. You allow the interaction to unfold, but you no longer invest in potential. You pay attention to consistency, because the dynamic has changed, but it's not fully redefined yet. That part depends on what they do next. And this is the paradox most people struggle with. When you stop chasing, they may start moving toward you. But the moment you start chasing again, the entire shift collapses. The curiosity fades, the pattern returns, and you're back where you started. So the power isn't in making them curious. The power is in not losing yourself when they are. Because curiosity can bring them back, but only consistency can keep them there. And after all of this, the broken patterns, the emotional independence, the silence, the loss of control, the curiosity, you arrive at the part that actually matters. Not what they do next, not whether they come closer or pull away again, but who you've become in the process. Because this is where most people misunderstand the transformation. They think the goal is to change the avoidant, to finally get a different response, to unlock some version of them that was hidden behind distance. But that's not where the real power is. The real shift happens when you stop organizing your life around that outcome entirely. When you choose yourself, not as a reaction, but as a standard. And that choice is deeper than it sounds. It's not just about walking away or setting boundaries in a moment of frustration. It's about fundamentally redefining what you accept, what you engage with, and what you no longer negotiate. It's about no longer confusing inconsistency with complexity or distance with depth. You begin to see things as they are, not as you hoped they could be. And from that place, your decisions become clearer, not easier, but clearer. You're no longer pulled in multiple directions by emotion, memory, or potential. You're anchored in something more stable, self-respect. And self-respect changes your tolerance. Things that once felt normal, delayed responses, emotional unavailability, mixed signals, no longer feel neutral. They feel misaligned, not because you've become rigid or closed off, but because you've developed a standard that reflects your growth. You're not asking for perfection. You're asking for consistency, presence, reciprocity. And here's the part that often surprises people. When you truly reach this point, whether they come back or not stops being the central question, because you're no longer waiting. You're no longer holding space for someone who isn't actively choosing to be in it. You're open to connection, but you're no longer attached to a specific person fulfilling that role. And that shift, subtle but profound, is what changes the entire dynamic permanently. Because now, if they return, they're not returning to the same version of you. They're meeting someone who is grounded, clear, and no longer willing to participate in emotional uncertainty. Someone who doesn't need to be convinced, reassured, or chased. Someone who is already whole, already stable, already complete in their own right, and that changes how they show up, or whether they show up at all. Some will step forward, recognizing the shift, attempting to meet you at this new level. Others will fall back, not because you did anything wrong, but because the version of connection they were comfortable with no longer exists. And for the first time, you don't try to fix that. You allow it. Because choosing yourself means allowing reality to filter what doesn't align. It means trusting that what is consistent, present, and mutual will remain, and what isn't, won't. There's a kind of freedom in that. Not the kind that comes from detachment or indifference, but the kind that comes from clarity. You're no longer negotiating your worth in subtle ways. You're no longer interpreting inconsistency as something you need to solve. You've stepped out of the role entirely. And when you do that, everything changes. Not because they changed, but because the version of you that accepted less is no longer available. That's the real transformation. Because in the end, this was never about making them realize they can't break you. It was about you realizing they never could. And when you step back and look at the entire journey, you start to see it for what it really is. This was never just about an avoidant, their behavior, or trying to decode their distance. It was about a pattern, one you participated in, one you eventually understood, and ultimately one you chose to break. At first, it feels like you're losing something, the connection, the possibility, the version of them you held on to. But what you're actually losing is the illusion that you had to work for consistency, that you had to earn clarity, that love required you to abandon yourself just to keep someone close. And once that illusion falls away, something far more stable takes its place. You stop reacting and you start observing. You stop chasing and you start choosing. You stop trying to control the outcome and you start controlling what you accept. And in that shift, the entire dynamic, no matter who it's with, changes permanently. Because now you're no longer operating from fear of loss. You're operating from alignment, and that's what makes you unbreakable. Not because nothing affects you, not because you've shut down or stopped caring, but because you've built a foundation that isn't dependent on someone else's inconsistency. You've learned to stay grounded even when someone else pulls away. You've learned to remain whole even when connection is uncertain. And from that place, everything becomes clear. If they come back, they meet a version of you that no longer tolerates confusion. If they don't, you keep moving forward without needing closure from someone who couldn't provide it. Either way, you win. Not by changing them, but by no longer needing them to be different. That's the shift. That's the power. That's the moment everything changes. Because in the end, the strongest position you can ever stand in is the one where you no longer need to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself.